Welcome back everyone. For today's video we are going to be taking a look at FIDE World Rapid and Blitz Team Chess Championship, which is being held in Astana, Kazakhstan. Now many top players are competing in this event, including the former 5-time world chess champion Magnus and the current world champion Ding Laurent. So the first game we're going to be taking a look at is a game that was played in the third round of the rapid portion of the event between the rising star from India, Arjun and Hans. Now he's one of the trio, one of the Indian players who has really risen above the rest, and he is going to be a future contender to potentially win the world championship. So we have Arjun playing against Magnus, Arjun with the white pieces, and let's dive right into the action. So the game starts with the move e4. We get the move e5 being played here by Magnus, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and now we have the move knight f6. So what Magnus is doing here is he's playing the classic Berlin defense, bringing the knights out to c6 and f6 right away, and Arjun already has a decision. Now here, there are a couple ways that white can force a draw. The most common one is to play, not king f1, sorry, is the castle, go knight e4, d4, knight d6, takes, a4, takes, takes, d5, takes, and there's a repetition here with queen e4 and queen e6 infinitely. So this is one of the common ways that white can force a draw, but one thing that we should keep in mind is that Arjun is a player who's very aggressive. Now one thing Arjun has had to do, unlike a lot of other top players, is he has played a lot of open terms to try and boost his rating, playing against players who are a little bit weaker and needing to win every game. Additionally, Magnus himself has said something along the lines that Arjun is a player who's a psycho and he tries to kill you, tries to beat you every game. He is a madman. Now I might have the quote slightly wrong, but it's essentially along those lines. So Arjun of course plays the move d3 here. He chooses to play on against the world champion and he wants to try and win. Magnus goes d6, we get the move castles, bishop e7, now we have d4, and Magnus castles his king out of the center of the board. Here we get the move d5, and now Magnus plays the move a6. This might be slightly inaccurate according to the computer, but it's not a big deal at any rate. We get the move bishop to e2. If white were to take with the bishop here, for example, after takes, black captures the pawn on e4, and now we have even material, but white has pawns stacked on the same file on c2 and c6, and additionally black has a big black center here and the two b's to boot, so black should be better. All right, so here we get the move bishop to e2, and now we have the move knight to b8 being played by Magnus, and now we get the move bishop d3. Now if Arjun were to play bishop d3, another option here to guard the pawn, perhaps he's worried about knight to b4 attacking the bishop, but white could retreat the bishop here to e2 because if black takes after c3 here, it's spaghetti-o. This knight has no squares to move to without being captured. So Arjun probably was a little bit worried about that, so he goes to e2, and after knight b8, now he has to waste time and go back to d3 versus having the bishop on d3 right away here with this move bishop d3. So we get bishop b2, knight e8, bishop d3, knight b d7, and now we have the move c4. Magnus goes knight to c5, and now we get the move knight c3. Magnus of course takes the bishop on d3, we get queen d3, and now we have the move knight e8. Now as you'll notice from the eval bar, black is already slightly better here, and the main reason is that black has the two b's, and black also has some great ideas to start opening up the king side by pushing this f pawn and opening up the f file. Arjun goes to a4, we get f5, and now we have the move a5, and here Magnus takes on e4. Get the move knight takes e4, bishop to f5 play, developing the bishop and pinning the knight on e4. We get the move bishop e3, knight f6, knight d2, white has to guard the knight on e4, and now we get the move queen e8, where Magnus intends to move the queen either to g6 or to h5 in the next couple of turns. We get the move knight takes f6, rook takes, and now knight e4 played by Arjun. Magnus goes rook f8, and here we have the move f3, basically further cementing this horse on e4. Now the one problem for Arjun here in this position is that even though everything is very stable, he is lacking a lot of the ideas to attack on the queen side here, and Magnus has very simple plans to play moves like queen g6 and potentially double stack the rooks on the f file and try to attack towards the white king on g1. So we get queen g6, b4 played by Arjun, we get the move h5 here. Rook f7 also is a possibility, but Magnus decides he wants to start pushing the h pawn down the board instead. We get the move b5, h4 played by Magnus, we get the move b6 here, and this is a move the computer really doesn't like. Now it's a very logical decision by Arjun. He's trying to weaken the base of his pawn chain. What white would love to play is something like c5 and let's say king h7 and then b6 here, as black will have problems defending both of these pawns. Now if white were to play c5 right away, this would be a mistake here because I believe that black can simply play h3 here, threatening mate, and after g3 probably can play this move d takes c5, and black is simply up a pawn here in the center of the board. So we get b6 instead. Magnus now plays the move pawn takes pawn. We get bishop takes pawn, and now we have the move rook c8 here. Another great move from Magnus, trying to put pressure on the c file. And at this point, Magnus has everything he could ask for. He's got this pressure with the pin in the center of the board. He can push h3 to try to attack on the g file. He has a rook on a half open f file, and the other rook is on the half open c file. So Magnus has perfect placement of all his pieces. So here we get the move c5 being played. Arjun plays the move h3, or not Arjun, sorry. Arjun plays c5, Magnus goes to h3. Now we get the move g3. Of course, white has to stop black from creating the checkmate on the g2 square. Magnus takes knight on e4. We get queen takes, and now after pawn takes pawn, we've reached an endgame where Magnus simply has an extra pawn on c5. Now, one drawback to this position for Magnus is that white does have a protected passed pawn here. This is a passed pawn, and it's supported by the pawn on e4, so white does have a little bit of counterplay, but this pawn on h3 is very useful in the endgame as black can try to attack the pawn. Additionally, it's the opposite color of this dark square b, so all the general endgame principles here are in Magnus's favor. So we get the move rook takes rook. Magnus takes with the king. We get king f2. Now we have c4. We get the move king to e2. And now Magnus plays this move bishop c5. Now, as you'll notice, it's not completely winning for black here, but there is one very important point about this. Black has the passed c pawn that can go up the board, but this pawn on h3 is also very, very critical. Because if we were to go back, I'll just go back a few moves here. Let me set up the same position. Let's just say we get some position like this, and we get the same endgame here. Something like this. I'm just going to set it up so you guys can see it. Something like, let's say takes here and bishop c5 where the pawns are on h4 and h3. Here, white is almost not worse at all after takes, and a move like king to d2 intending to go king c3, or even a move like rook b1 intending to take the pawn on b7. Now, the reason I mention this is because when we go forward to this endgame right here with bishop c5, Arjun plays the move rook b1. He does not trade the bishops here, so if he were to trade and play a move like rook to b1, now after takes, and rook to a2, let's just say you go king f3, rook takes h2, suddenly you have this h pawn and c pawn that are both going up the board. So Magnus pushing this pawn down to h3, it created initial mating threats, but in the end game it actually is very, very vital to have this pawn so far up the board. So Arjun goes rook b1, we get the move c3, and now we have king to d3 being played, and here Magnus trades the bishops on b6. Now, this is a rapid game, to be clear, and Arjun is very low on time, so you can't fault him. Arjun probably thought that in this endgame, after king to d3 and takes, pawn takes, that with this protected passed pawn on d5, he could never be losing. Unfortunately for Arjun, he is wrong. So Magnus goes c2, we got this move rook to c1 with king e7. Arjun has to take the pawn. We got chop, king d6, king b3, king c5, g4, g5 is played, king c3, and now king takes pawn. Now, Arjun probably thought this was a drawn endgame because the main issue is that in this endgame, if black ever tries to go forward with the king here to d4, white can push this pawn through and create a queen. And even with the king on c5, this pawn is always protected by this pawn behind it on e4. So with this protected passed pawn, you might think that it's a draw. Unfortunately for Arjun, and unfortunately for, I would say, most of us top players who have played Magnus over the years, this is an endgame where, unfortunately, the moves simply lead to a forced win for Magnus with the black pieces. So we get king b4, we get a5, king c4, king c7, king b5, and now a very important move b6 to protect the pawn, king a4, king d7 is played. If you were to go king d6 here, white can go king to b5, and you can't push the pawn or infiltrate with the king, and so you would have to go for a zugzwang once again. So we get the move king to d7, king b5, king d6. Now white has to yield. If you go to c4, there's a4. If you go this way, there is king to c5. So we get king c4, a4, king b4, b5 here. Now black also has a protected passed pawn. White cannot capture the pawn because now this a pawn will run up the board. So we get king a3, king c5, king b2, b4, king c2, and now Magnus plays the move b3 check in the position. We get king c3, Magnus goes king to b5, and now Arjun plays the move king to d2. If Arjun were to play king to b2 here, black can actually ignore this passed pawn now. You go king b4, d6, a3 check. If you go king to a1 here, black goes king c3, let's say d7, and there are probably many ways to win here, but the nicest one is to simply go king c2, white queens, you go check, you queen, takes, and queen to b3, which checkmates the king on the a3 square. So Arjun goes king to d2 here. We get the move a3, king c3, Magnus plays a2, king to b2, and here king c4 is possible because these pawns are so far advanced up the board. So we get the move d6, Magnus goes king d3, and here Arjun resigns the game in view of the same pattern that we saw in the analysis a few moves ago, where after d7, queen takes, king c2, queen, there's b2, b1, queen, and then there is queen to b3, checkmate. So a very nice win for Magnus. Shows great class in the middle game, pushing the pawns up the board, showcasing the power of the bishops, and then a really nice conversion into the rook and pawn endgame, and then into the king and pawn endgame. Simply an endgame supreme for Magnus, and showing once again why he is the best endgame player in the world, in addition to basically being the best player overall. So a fantastic win for Magnus in this game, and he is off to a red hot start with a win in his first game. All right, so the second game we're going to be taking a look at is a game that is played between the current world chess champion Ding Liren from China. He hasn't played very much in recent times, but I think he's trying to get ready for the world championship match, which he will be playing in November in Singapore. So Ding is coming sort of out of his quiet semi-retirement, I guess you could call it, or whatever you want to put it, or sabbatical even, and he's playing against a man who wants to be the self-proclaimed first American world champion, and that would of course be Hans Niemann, who very recently won an extremely big matchup against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in the Speed Chess Championship. All right, so Ding playing with the white pieces, America's future first world champion with the black pieces. Let's get right into the action. So the game starts with the move d4. We have the move knight f6, c4, e6, and now Ding plays the move g3. Now this is what is known as the Catalan system for white. Instead of going into the queen's gambit declined or other setups, he decides to play g3. Now this is a system that has been popularized a lot over the recent probably decade or so. Almost every top player, including myself, has played it at some point. So you get d5, bishop g2 is played, Hans goes bishop e7, knight f3, castles, d takes c4, and now we get the move queen c2. So far, all pretty standard. Now, this is where Hans plays move b5. Now, to give you guys a little bit of to go back in the time machine, and let's just do kind of like a little bit of the time warp here. This is a system that I actually started playing a lot in 2019. I had some great success with it. I thought that it was probably the most solid setup for black against the Catalan. Magnus also played it a little bit, but I played it very specifically in a couple of the Grand Chess Tour events, and then ultimately I played it in a FIDE Grand Prix classical tournament against Alexander Grishuk in May of 2019, where he simply came with a great setup. I got a worse position, I lost the game, it killed my chance to qualify for the 2020 candidates via the FIDE Grand Prix cycle, and that was kind of the end of my experience with this line. So this line has been played some. Most people here, I would say, prefer to play a6, but at the end of the day, this is probably okay if you know the line perfectly. So we get b5. a4 played here by Ding, and now we have the move bishop b7. I will point out this was also played in the World Championship in 2020 between Magnus and Nepo. So we get bishop b7, takes, a6 is played, we get takes, knight takes a6, queen c4, bishop d5, queen c3, and now we have the move knight e4. Now white is up a pawn here. This pawn on b2 is an extra pawn. Black is hoping the quick development, the wooden shield in the middle of the board, combined with opening up the c file by pushing the pawn and bringing the rook here, will be adequate counterplay for sacrificing a pawn. So we get queen e1, c5 played by Hans. We get the move bishop to e3, knight to b4, takes, and now we have the move knight c3 being played. Now all this is standard theory. Takes, knight c2, queen d2, takes, and here Hans takes on d4. We got pawn takes pawn, and now we have the move rook to d8 being played, queen to f4, and here Hans decides to play this move bishop f6. Now it's interesting to note what's going on, because I've had this position quite a few times, and normally the best move here is to trade and then play queen to b8, trying to trade off the queens right away and play this endgame where white has an extra pawn on the d file, but with it being 5 versus 4, black should be able to draw, especially in view of the fact that it is opposite color bishops. Hans decides instead here to play the move bishop f6, and now we get the move e3, and we have the move h6 being played. Now I will point out that this opening from Hans, trying to be super solid, there is nothing wrong with it, but I do feel for a player like Hans who tries to be very aggressive, thinks he's great, as good as the top players even, it feels as though when he tries to play something where he's slightly worse with no counter chance of winning the game, he can go astray. So we get the move h4 here. Hans plays rook c8 here, and now we get the move knight e1. Now, as I said before, normally when you play these systems with black, you want to trade the bishop for the knight at some point to create this endgame with the opposite color b's, because after rook c8 and knight e1 is played, sure, white is only going to be up a pawn, but now if black has to trade the bishops, we end up with a bishop versus the knight, and the knight is actually much better than the light square b here. So we get rook e8, takes, queen to f3, queen c4, and now we have queen e4, and we get this move rook c8. Knight d3 played by Ding, we get queen b5, and now we have rook a1. Now what has happened here is that Ding is clearly better. He has an extra pawn in the center of the board. We also have a classic flying V formation with the pawns, and this knight can really start jumping every which way, and now it's a matter of technique. If the current world champion plays well here, if he shows great technique, he should be able to win this game. And additionally, it is a sign of the form that he's in going to the World Championship match, because a lot of the games I predict are going to involve small advantages where you have to show great technique to try and grind and win, like the former world champion Magnus. So we get g6, king g2 is played here, and now we have the move queen d7. Ding plays h5, a great move. We get g5 here. Probably if I were black here, I would have tried to play h5 to create this chain of pawns, because now after queen d7 and h5 is played, if you take the pawn on h5 here, white can go knight to f4, attacking the pawn. If you push, there's knight h5, and suddenly there are all kinds of threats towards the black king. And if you don't take and you play g5, now this pawn on h5 is safe for the rest of the game. Bishop can never attack it. King can't even get there. Say you could randomly even trade some queens here. Sorry, not queen 6, queen c6, takes in g4. You can never get after this pawn on h5. And additionally, these two pawns are on the opposite color of this dark square B. So structurally, this is very, very good for white to get this structure. We get h5, g5, rook b1 played by Ding. We got queen c6, the trade, and now we have the move rook b7 being played. Now this is a slight mistake here, because I think the computer says black can play g4 here and try to keep it going. Both players simply trying to not make any weaknesses. So we get rook c2, knight c5, and now we have king f8. g4 played by Ding. Finally, to protect the pawn on h5, we get the move rook a2, and now we have king f3. Rook c2, knight d3. Worth pointing out that white never wants to trade the knight for the b here, because this endgame with 5 pawns versus 4 should be a draw, since all these pawns are on the same side of the board. So we get knight d3. We have the move rook d2, rook b3, bishop b7. A lot of dilly-dallying here for both players. Ding now goes f3 here, further reinforcing the chain of pawns. Black doesn't have f5 here, and the king also guards the knight on d3. We get bishop d6. Knight e5 is played, and here we have rook f2 being played by Hans. This is a very interesting situation, but I think that if black were to take this in this specific position, this endgame might be losing, because after king takes pawn, you can't ever push the pawn without losing this one. Additionally, you can't ever move the king, because then the white king gets in and white will infiltrate and win the game. And additionally, if you go rook f2 here, white can now play e4. Rook guards the base of the chain. This pawn really does guard every other pawn here in the structure. And additionally, white can play d5 and create a passed pawn. Say rook e2, king d6, rook d2, d5, takes, king f6, and then a move like rook c3. And white probably should be winning here, with the rook protecting the pawns and the king actively helping to escort the d pawn up the board. So after knight e5, Hans goes rook to f2. We get knight d3, rook d2, rook c3, rook e2, knight e5, and we get rook f2 back. Hans, of course, unwilling to trade the bishop for the knight, and he's basically asking Ding, how do you make progress? So here we get the move knight to c4. We have bishop g3, rook b3, we get rook c2, knight e5 again, and here we get rook f2. Apparently in this position, bishop takes e5 and rook c6. Rook c6 is actually enough for black to save the game, because here if white ever goes to e4, you run into f6, and it's a real spaghetti-o moment as your king simply gets checkmated in the center of the board. And if you can't push e4 here, even in this position, if you ever have to go d5, you're not getting a passed pawn. It's a 4 versus 3 endgame, and it will be a draw. Now, of course, without stock, which without being able to see the evaluation, very, very hard to know that this is completely fine. But nonetheless, it would have been a draw. So we get the move rook to f2. Now we have knight c6 back. Worth pointing out here, if white goes rook b7 after black takes, you cannot take with the king, because then you lose the pawn on f3 and it's an equal position. And if you take with the pawn, once again, you can no longer create the pass pawn on the d file here, and the game will be a draw. So we get knight c6. We have the move rook c2, d5 played, and now we get this move king f6. Now, the reason Hans did not trade the pawns here is because he was worried that now white will be able to run this knight to f5 here, get a bastion, and attack all of black's kingside pawns. One sample line is something like, I don't know, bishop f2, check, and then rook to b6 here. The knight and the rook combine here to win the game for white. So we get the move king f6. Apparently computer, I think, says rook c5 is best, and after knight d4, if you take with the rook, there's knight f5 check, which is a beautiful tactic. You move the king, you lose the bishop. Take with the knight, you lose the rook. Very, very deep stuff. And I guess if you take with a pawn, there's king d3 with knight f5 and rook b6 again. And apparently white is winning, but not so straightforward. So we get king f6. Here we have rook b6 played by Ding. Now we get bishop f2. We have the move d takes e6. And now Hans finds rook c3 here, trying to really muddy the waters and complicate the situation. Here Ding plays move e takes f7, which is still good, but the computer actually likes this move e7, and after rook takes e3, king d5, white is winning here. Probably the reason Ding did not do this was twofold. or threefold or fourfold, however many folds. But basically the reason is that he probably thought that their idea is like rook to e6 here, where the rook attacks the knight and the bishop attacks the rook for starters. This would lose, by the way, because after rook e6 there's rook to b8, knight guards the pawn here, and you will push the pawn forward and win material. If black plays rook takes e7, which is probably another reason Ding didn't consider this, after knight takes rook, bishop takes rook, knight f5, it's not completely clear that white's winning here. Now white is winning in this position with knight to f5, and the reason is that eventually, let's just say bishop g1, you can go king to d6, let's say bishop f2, king to d7 here, bishop g1, and now you go king to e8, and after bishop c5 you push the pawn with h. Actually, you don't push the pawn. I thought h6 was best, but I think knight h6 is actually cleaner to win this pawn on f7, and you will win the game. Also, keep in mind that in this endgame, even here at the start, all of white's pieces are on the opposite color of the bishop. Bishop cannot touch any of these pieces, so it will be winning. But Ding decides instead to go for e takes f7. We get rook e3, king d5, king takes f7. Now we have the move rook to a6 here. Apparently rook b7, king f6, rook to h7 would have been a little bit better for white, but from a human perspective this makes a ton of sense to keep the rook on the 6th rank to spy the pawn whenever you move the knight away from c6. So we get rook d3, king e4, rook e3, king d5, rook d3, king c4, and now Hans plays rook d1. We get the move knight to e5, king g7, check, king h7, knight to f7, and Hans finds the best move, rook to d4. Now one of the things about Hans, as I mentioned during the SEC against MVL, is he has been playing very well when he's been low on time or under a lot of pressure, finding some very good defensive moves. So we get king b5, rook to f4, knight h6, rook takes f3, and now we have the move knight to f5. White still is up a pawn on the king side. It's 2v1 here, but the pawn on g5 is very weak. So Hans plays bishop to h4, apparently a losing move, but hard to fault him for playing it. Apparently rook c3, rook takes, check, and rook c8 is maybe kind of okay here. Although honestly, you know, I can see from the computer saying it's not completely conclusive, but from a human perspective, with two pawns on the edge of the board, it does feel like white should be winning. So we get bishop h4, rook g7, king h8. Here we have the move h6 being played. The pawn supports the rook, and now what white would love to do is play knight to e7 here and go for knight g6, simply checkmating the black king in the corner of the board. So we get the move rook to b3, and here Ding makes a very, very big mistake with this move king c5. As you can tell from the valuation, if Ding had played the move king to c6 here, this is +9. The game is over. There is nothing that Hans can do here. Now the reason Ding probably didn't play this is he saw bishop to f2, and if you go knight to e7, it's spaghetti. There's rook b6 here, and you win this pawn on h6. Now knight g6 is not a checkmate, because then you would hang the rook on g7. But if black plays this move bishop to f2 here, white can play the move knight to d6, trying to checkmate on this f7 square, and after rook b6, king d5, it's simply helpless, as you will have to give up this rook for the knight, or else knight to f7 will end the game on the spot. So instead, in this position, Ding plays the move king c5. We get the move bishop to f2. We have king d5. Now we get rook b5, and here Ding plays this move king to e6, and rather abruptly it seems that Hans resigned the game here. Now as you guys can tell from the valuation, that white is only very marginally better, but Hans was probably thinking here that it was simply hopeless. He probably thought, well, check, white goes king f7, and then something like check, king g6 here, and after rook b6, king g5 is probably good enough, king h5 is also good enough, and Hans simply thought it was losing. Now keep in mind, this is from the relay, where after king to e6, we don't know if there were more moves played. The relay basically broke. We saw king e6 being played, and then like 5 seconds later it showed king e4 as being 1-0 for white, which means the players rearranged the kings since they're using a digital board. But my best guess is that Hans probably resigned here in view of the fact that he thought the white king was running up the board, and white would be able to checkmate black or win the pawn on g5 and be in a technically winning endgame. However, the computer says here that after rook b6, king f7, if black plays the move bishop c5 and white plays the very logical rook takes g5 here, after check, king here, and rook to b1, apparently white is actually not winning here, which is simply mind-blowing, but it also shows just how strong computers are to say this is only 0.3, because if I had this position, I'd probably assume if I'm black, I'm lost. If I'm white, I'm completely winning. Simply not realistic for a human who is not 3,500. So after king to e6, as far as we know, Hans most likely resigned the game here. He thought it was a hopeless position, and with that, Ding gets a very, very nice win in his first event back. So Both Ding and Magnus, two great world champions, are back in the hunt here. They're playing this team event in Astana. So far, so good for both. I'm pretty sure that they will be playing against each other later on in the event, so I will most certainly be doing a recap of that game whenever it happens. It's not going to be today, but it might be tomorrow, so stay tuned for that recap. But at any rate, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap with some analysis from the FIDE World Rapid and Blitz Team Championship being held in Astana, Kazakhstan. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we will be back soon with some more great recaps here on YouTube. See you guys. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.